Costello grew up in the crowded immigrant neighborhoods of New York, surrounded by poverty, struggle, and limited choices. For many young men, crime was the only path forward. Together, they became architects of a new criminal order. During the era of Prohibition in the United States, America unintentionally created one of the biggest opportunities for organized crime in history. He noticed that the real power didn't belong to the loudest men with guns, it belonged to the quiet men in suits, sitting behind desks, making decisions that shaped entire cities. As he entered the underworld, Costello quickly realized that violence was only a short-term strategy. Welcome to Xfinity Evolution, where history comes alive and legends are reborn. In the shadowy streets of New York City, where ambition, danger, and survival collided every single day, power usually came at a deadly price. Men clawed their way to the top through violence, betrayal, and fear. Alliances were temporary, loyalty was fragile, and death was always just one mistake away. But in that ruthless world, one man stood apart, not because he was the most feared, not because he was the most violent, but because he understood something deeper than everyone else. His name was Frank Costello, and he would go on to become one of the most intelligent and influential figures in the history of organized crime. Born in Italy and brought to America as a child, Costello grew up in the crowded immigrant neighborhoods of New York, surrounded by poverty, struggle, and limited choices. For many young men, crime was the only path forward. But even in those early years, Costello showed signs that he was different. He wasn't driven by anger or ego, he was driven by observation. He watched how power worked, not just on the streets, but in society. He noticed that the real power didn't belong to the loudest men with guns, it belonged to the quiet men in suits, sitting behind desks, making decisions that shaped entire cities. As he entered the underworld, Costello quickly realized that violence was only a short-term strategy. It brought attention, enemies, and eventually, downfall. Instead, he chose a path that very few criminals at the time truly understood. He built relationships. He invested in influence. And most importantly, he learned how to make powerful people depend on him. This mindset aligned perfectly with another rising figure in organized crime, Lucky Luciano, a man who shared a vision of transforming the Mafia from chaotic street gangs into a structured, efficient empire. Together, they became architects of a new criminal order. During the era of Prohibition in the United States, America unintentionally created one of the biggest opportunities for organized crime in history. Alcohol was banned, but demand didn't disappear, it exploded. And with that demand came billions of dollars in illegal profits. While many gangsters rushed into bootlegging with brute force, Costello approached it like a businessman. He saw networks, supply chains, partnerships. He saw systems. And through careful planning and alliances, he helped build an empire that generated enormous wealth. But money was only part of the equation. Costello understood something far more valuable: influence over the system itself. He began forming connections with politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials. Not through threats, but through calculated favors, financial incentives, and mutual benefit. He became a man who could make problems disappear, who could influence decisions without ever appearing in public. Soon, his power extended far beyond the streets. He wasn't just a gangster anymore. He was a silent force operating behind the structure of American society. This is why he earned the nickname, the Prime Minister of the Underworld. Unlike many mafia bosses who craved attention and recognition, Costello avoided the spotlight. He dressed well, spoke calmly, and carried himself like a legitimate businessman. He attended high-level meetings, moved in influential circles, and maintained an image that kept suspicion at a distance. He knew that the more invisible he remained, the longer he would survive. And for a long time, that strategy worked perfectly. But power, no matter how carefully managed, always attracts rivals. And in the world of organized crime, the greatest danger often comes from within. One of the most ambitious and dangerous figures rising in the Mafia was Vito Genovese. Unlike Costello, Genovese believed in dominance through fear. He saw violence not as a last resort, but as a primary tool. To him, Costello's diplomatic style was not strength, it was weakness. And he wanted control of the empire Costello had built. Tension between the two men grew silently, like a storm waiting to break. And in 1957, it finally did. One night, as Costello returned to his apartment building, a gunman stepped out of the shadows. There was no warning, no time to react. A single shot was fired at close range, striking Costello in the head. In that moment, it seemed like the story of one of the Mafia's greatest minds had come to a violent end, just like so many others before him. But fate had something else in mind. The bullet didn't kill him. It grazed his skull. Miraculously, Frank Costello survived. In a world built on retaliation, survival after an assassination attempt demands one thing: revenge. Everyone expected it. A brutal, all-out war between factions. Blood in the streets. Chaos within the Mafia. It was almost inevitable. But once again, Costello did what no one expected. He chose not to fight. He chose not to retaliate. Instead, he made a decision that shocked the entire underworld. He stepped down from power. To outsiders, it looked like surrender. But to those who truly understood the game, it was a move of pure genius. Costello realized that revenge would only lead to endless conflict, drawing attention from law enforcement, and ultimately destroying everything he had built. By stepping away, he avoided war, protected his legacy, and secured something far more valuable than power: his life. And that decision changed everything. While other Mafia bosses continued fighting, getting arrested, or being killed, Costello quietly faded into the background. He still had influence, still had connections, but he no longer carried the burden of leadership. He had outplayed not just his enemies, but the entire system. Law enforcement agencies had spent years trying to bring him down completely. But unlike many others, Costello left behind very little evidence. He was careful, calculated, always thinking ahead. He didn't make emotional decisions. He didn't let ego control him. And because of that, he avoided the fate that claimed so many others in his world. Years passed, and the once powerful Prime Minister of the Underworld lived a relatively peaceful life. Not as a kingpin, not as a feared boss, but as a man who had already won the most important battle: survival. Frank Costello's story isn't just a tale of crime, it's a masterclass in strategy, psychology, and power. He proved that intelligence can be more dangerous than violence. That patience can outlast aggression. And that true power doesn't always need to be seen to be felt. In a world where men fought to hold power, he walked away from it. And in a world where almost everyone lost in the end. If you want to understand how history is unfolding before our eyes, don't miss what comes next. Revisit Xfinity Evolution for deeper insights and powerful stories. Stay informed, stay curious, and join us again on Xfinity Evolution, where the world's biggest events come into focus.